she threw the copper cent at my feet. It bounced once on the marble before settling near my worn shoes. 300 executives stared at me in total silence. I tightened my grip on Lily's small, trembling hand. Victoria laughed, a cold sound that echoed across the room. She had absolutely no idea who I really was. "Take the cent and run, little man." I beat her, utterly and completely. And then I stood up and did the one thing nobody saw coming. I'll tell you exactly what it was in just a minute. But first, let me tell you who I was the night she crossed the line. If you have ever been the person in the room that everyone looked through instead of at, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is for you. I worked as a senior data analyst on the basement floor. It was the perfect place to hide my true identity. 5 years ago, I built this entire company from the ground up. But when my wife died, I stepped away from the boardroom entirely. I needed to be a father to Lily, far away from corporate vultures. So I became a ghost in my own multi-billion-dollar empire. The door slammed open, shattering the quiet of my office. Victoria stood there, holding a manila folder like it was a weapon. "Your report is complete garbage, Arthur." I looked calmly at the numbers on my monitor. They were perfectly accurate, and she knew it. She threw the file directly across my desk. The papers scattered, drifting onto the floor like dead leaves. I kept my face completely blank. Anger flared in my chest, but I pushed it down for Lily's sake. The data proved Victoria had been embezzling company funds for months. I had quietly flagged the massive discrepancies to the shadow board. She didn't know I was the silent owner watching her every move. She only saw a lowly analyst trying to ruin her stellar career. "You are nothing but a bug in my system." I slowly gathered the scattered papers, never breaking eye contact. The cold wind bit through my thin coat as I waited. The school bell rang, a sharp sound cutting through the city noise. Lily ran out, her tiny boots splashing in the gray puddles. I knelt down to catch her, feeling the heavy weight of the day lift. But her bright smile faded the second she looked at my face. She always knew when something was wrong, just like her mother. "Are you sad again, Daddy?" I forced a reassuring smile and brushed the wet hair from her eyes. I promised her mother I would protect her from the ugly side of the world. But Victoria was forcing my hand, dragging me back into the light. Our apartment was small, nothing like the sprawling mansion we left behind. I watched Lily draw at the kitchen table under the flickering bulb. My phone buzzed on the counter, vibrating violently against the cheap wood. It was an email from the executive board, demanding my immediate presence. Victoria had summoned me to the annual charity gala tonight. She wanted to fire me publicly to make a terrifying example out of me. I looked at Lily, realizing my only babysitter had canceled an hour ago. I had absolutely no choice but to bring her into the lion's den. "Put your nice dress on, sweetie." It was finally time to end this ridiculous charade once and for all. Rain started to fall as we pulled up to the glittering hotel. Valets in sharp red uniforms rushed to open the doors of luxury cars. I parked my beaten sedan in the dark, far corner of the lot. Lily held my hand tightly, intimidated by the towering glass building. I remembered buying this exact property 7 years ago. Now I was walking into it like a beggar off the street. A security guard stepped into our path, blocking the grand entrance entirely. "Service entrance is around the back, pal." I didn't blink. I just stared at his brass name tag. I was already losing my patience with this entire miserable evening. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my standard employee badge. I didn't use the solid platinum founder's card hidden deep in my wallet. The guard scanned it, his expression shifting from arrogant to deeply annoyed. He stepped aside, but not without a loud, disappointed scoff. I squeezed Lily's hand, feeling her fast pulse racing against my palm. I hated subjecting her to the very elitism I tried so hard to escape. But tonight was going to be a lesson she needed to see firsthand. "Keep your head up, Lily." We walked through the sliding glass doors and stepped into the blinding light. The lobby was a massive sea of silk dresses and tailored tuxedos. Classical music floated down softly from the grand balcony above us. People parted to avoid us, throwing disgusted glances at my cheap suit. I recognized half the board members sipping champagne by the marble fountain. None of them recognized the man who actually signed their massive paychecks. The anonymity used to bring me immense peace after my wife passed away. Tonight it felt like a heavy suit of armor I was ready to shed. "They're looking at us funny, Daddy." I knelt down right in the middle of the crowded, wealthy lobby. I didn't care about the harsh stares of the billionaires standing around me. I gently adjusted the crooked collar of Lily's simple blue dress. I looked directly into her frightened, beautiful brown eyes. The memory of her mother's fierce strength rushed back into my mind. I needed her to carry that exact same strength with her tonight. The whispering around us grew louder, but I tuned it all out. "Lions don't care about the opinions of sheep." She nodded, her tiny shoulders straightening just a fraction of an inch. I stood up, feeling a dangerous, icy calm wash over my entire body. We walked steadily toward the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom. The final showdown with Victoria was waiting patiently on the other side. The heavy doors opened, revealing a room dripping in diamonds and gold. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the painted ceiling like frozen ice. At the very center of the room stood Victoria, gripping a microphone tightly. She was giving a passionate speech about integrity and corporate responsibility. It was a sick joke, considering the millions she had just shamelessly stolen. Her sharp eyes scanned the crowd and locked directly onto me. A cruel, highly triumphant smile slowly spread across her bright red lips. She paused her speech, letting the suffocating silence stretch across the room. "Ah, our favorite little data entry clerk has arrived." Every single head in the massive ballroom turned to look at us. The bright spotlight swung aggressively, blinding me for a split second. Victoria's harsh voice crackled loudly through the expensive sound system. She wanted a ruthless public execution to hide her massive theft. I shielded Lily's eyes from the harsh, piercing white light. "Step up to the front, Arthur." The massive crowd of wealthy elites parted like the Red Sea. Their judgmental eyes burned into my cheap, poorly tailored gray suit. I remembered wearing a $10,000 tuxedo in this exact room. I held Lily's hand and walked forward with slow, deliberate steps. I absolutely refused to look at the ground like a beaten dog. "I'm scared, Daddy." I stopped exactly 3 feet away from the elevated velvet stage. Victoria looked down at me with pure, unfiltered corporate disgust. He held up a thick white envelope bearing the company's seal. "I designed that gold seal myself on a napkin 5 years ago. Now it was being weaponized against me by a desperate thief. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately." The ballroom erupted into cruel, hushed whispers and quiet, mocking laughs. Lily squeezed my fingers tightly, her small frame shaking slightly. My blood boiled, completely erasing years of forced, quiet patience. Victoria tossed the termination envelope off the stage into the crowd. It hit the polished marble floor with a soft, pathetic slap. "You do not have that authority." The entire room went dead silent at my quiet, absolute defiance. Victoria's smug smile cracked for a brief, highly satisfying second. A senior board member named Marcus stepped out of the shadows. Marcus was the only one who always respected my late wife. He looked at Victoria with visible unease and deep, brewing suspicion. "Victoria, perhaps we should handle this privately." Victoria snapped her head toward Marcus like a cornered, venomous viper. She needed this public spectacle to maintain her fragile, stolen dominance. I watched the fear flash behind her expensive, perfectly applied makeup. She gestured frantically toward the 2 burly security guards standing nearby. I shifted my weight, instantly calculating the physical distance between us. "Escort this trash out of my building." I remembered interviewing the head of security 7 long years ago. My brilliant wife sat next to me, holding a warm cup of coffee. I told him his only job was protecting the innocent employees. He swore he would never let greedy bullies run the corporate floor. "We build a safe haven, Arthur." The warm memory vanished as the first guard grabbed my shoulder. His grip was rough, digging painfully into my thin gray jacket. I didn't panic. I didn't even raise my resting heart rate. I simply twisted my shoulder and broke his strong grip instantly. The trained guard stumbled back, completely shocked by my sudden strength. "Don't make this difficult, buddy." Victoria's face turned completely red with absolute, uncontrollable corporate rage. She could not stand losing total control in front of her peers. She marched down the velvet stairs, her heels clicking aggressively loudly. I stood my ground, shielding Lily entirely behind my sturdy legs. The first crack in my carefully crafted disguise was finally showing. "You are nothing! Do you hear me?" Victoria aggressively snatched a small tip tray from a passing waiter. She grabbed a single dirty copper cent from the shiny silver plate. This was it. The absolute climax of her pathetic, unchecked arrogance. She threw the copper cent directly at my worn, scuffed shoes. It bounced once on the marble, echoing loudly in the dead silence. "Take the cent and run, little man." I heard a soft, muffled sob coming from directly behind me. I looked down and saw a single tear fall from Lily's eye. That single drop of salt water broke the final lock on my cage. The ghost of the quiet data analyst died instantly on that floor. I slowly reached into my inside pocket for my encrypted black phone. "You just made your final mistake." 5 miles away, a black fleet of luxury SUVs idled quietly. Inside the lead car, my personal lawyer sat holding a heavy briefcase. He had been waiting for my signal for 5 long, agonizing years. His dashboard phone lit up with a single, highly urgent text message. It was finally time to burn Victoria's stolen, corrupt empire to ashes. The sleeping dragon is finally awake. I pressed the single red button on my encrypted screen. The silent distress beacon instantly fired off to my legal team. I locked the screen before anyone could see the flashing coordinates. Victoria peered at my outdated phone and let out a vicious snort. She actually thought I was texting a cheap union representative for help. I slipped the heavy black device back into my worn gray pocket. I promised Lily I would never use my immense power for petty revenge. I wanted to show her that peace was better than total destruction. But stealing from my late wife's legacy was an unforgivable corporate sin. Victoria had dragged the silent monster completely out of the dark cave. "Victoria." "Who did you call? Your mommy?" Marcus stepped closer, his sharp eyes fixed entirely on my rigid stance. He noticed I wasn't sweating, shaking, or begging for my miserable job. 5 years ago, Marcus was my most trusted junior vice president. Personally mentored him when he was just a terrified young intern. I saw the gears turning rapidly behind his thick designer glasses. He recognized the unique, dominant posture of the man who hired him. The cheap gray suit was finally failing to hide my true nature. A thick bead of cold sweat rolled down Marcus's pale forehead. He slowly backed away from Victoria, sensing the invisible trap completely closing. He knew exactly what happened to people who challenged the real founder. "Victoria, stop talking right now." Outside, the heavy rain hammered relentlessly against the grand glass doors. The thunder masked the roaring engines of the approaching tactical vehicles. A massive line of 6 matte black SUVs screeched to a sudden halt. I built this private security detail to protect my late wife's privacy. Now they were storming the building like a highly trained military unit. The arrogant valet guard completely froze, dropping his expensive black umbrella. He stared in absolute terror as 20 heavily armed men stepped out. My lead attorney, David, stepped out into the freezing, violent rainstorm. He gripped the titanium briefcase containing Victoria's exact criminal financial timeline. He looked at the towering hotel with pure, unfiltered legal vengeance. "Lock down all the exits." David marched straight through the opulent lobby without flashing an ID. 12 massive security contractors in sharp, dark suits flanked him perfectly. The classical string quartet stopped playing their delicate instruments in sheer terror. Wealthy guests dropped their crystal champagne glasses onto the polished marble floors. I knew exactly how imposing David looked when he smelled corporate blood. He was the absolute most feared corporate litigator in the entire city. He dismantled multinational monopolies before eating his morning toast and coffee, and he only answered directly to the silent founder of the company. The terrified hotel manager sprinted forward to block the grand oak doors. David didn't even slow his aggressive, predatory walking pace a single inch. "You cannot go in there!" The heavy oak doors violently crashed open, shaking the massive crystal chandelier. The sheer, sudden force echoed like a bomb going off in the silence. 300 wealthy elites loudly gasped and backed away in absolute fear. I kept my hand firmly over Lily's shoulders, keeping her completely safe. I felt her small body relax slightly as my personal reinforcements arrive. Victoria spun around, her face twisting into pure, unadulterated corporate outrage. She did not recognize the apex predator walking furiously down her aisle, but she instantly recognized the terrifying, existential threat to her stolen kingdom. She gripped the silver microphone until her knuckles turned completely paper white. Her illusion of absolute control was rapidly shattering into a million pieces. "Security! Arrest these violent intruders!" The hotel security guards stepped forward, but David completely ignored them. His men easily shoved the useless guards aside like discarded paper dolls. David didn't even acknowledge the wealthy billionaires scattering like frightened little mice. He stopped exactly 5 feet away from the elevated velvet stage. He slowly opened the heavy titanium briefcase under the blinding stage spotlight. My heart hammered as I watched him pull out the bright red folder. That specific crimson folder was only supposed to be used for absolute emergencies. It meant the total, merciless liquidation of the current corrupt executive board. David held up a document stamped with the ultimate founder's gold seal. He stared directly at Victoria with eyes entirely devoid of human mercy. Protocol Omega has been initiated. 7 years ago, I sat in my penthouse office holding that exact stamp. My beautiful wife was reading over the extreme legal clauses of Protocol Omega. It was an absolute, devastating kill switch for the entire corporate executive board. I designed it to freeze all company assets if a hostile takeover occurred. She gently kissed my warm cheek and signed her name next to mine. Gold ink glittered under the expensive, imported crystal ceiling lights. We solemnly swore we would only use it if the company's soul died. I looked at her trusting smile, hoping I would never have to open it. Now I was dropping that exact nuclear bomb on a crowded ballroom floor. I knew there was absolutely no turning back from this destructive path now. Let's hope we never need it. The blinding stage light snapped me violently back to the tense present. The terrifying words, Protocol Omega, sent a massive shockwave through the room. Marcus physically collapsed into a nearby chair, clutching his chest incredibly tightly. Victoria looked at the red folder, her arrogant smirk heavily, visibly glitching. She knew Protocol Omega meant the silent founder was actively watching her. She knew it meant a full federal audit of her secret offshore accounts, but her massive, bloated ego completely blinded her to the obvious truth standing nearby. She actually thought David was bluffing to save a lowly data analyst. She pointed a shaking, perfectly manicured finger directly at David's stoic face. Desperation was a very ugly color on her heavily contoured, expensive face. "The founder is dead, you liar!" I absolutely needed to get Lily out of the crossfire before it escalated. I quickly pulled her into the quiet, dimly lit catering alcove nearby. The heavy velvet curtains completely blocked the chaotic screaming happening outside. I knelt down on the soft carpet, matching my eye level directly with hers. Her small hands were completely ice cold from the overwhelming, terrifying adult stress. I had to make the absolute hardest choice of my entire long life right now. Destroying Victoria publicly meant permanently exposing my face to the dangerous world again. It meant ending our quiet, peaceful life of eating cheap ice cream on Sundays. But hiding in the shadows meant letting evil people crush innocent souls forever. I brushed away her tear and gently kissed her cold, soft forehead. Daddy has to work now, okay? David's most trusted female bodyguard stepped quietly into the private velvet alcove. I nodded to her, trusting her implicitly with my only daughter's fragile life. Lily hugged my neck, her tiny arms squeezing with highly surprising strength. I breathed in the sweet scent of her cheap strawberry shampoo deeply. It anchored my entire soul before I walked back into the raging corporate storm. I stood up, physically feeling the heavy burden of my multi-billion-dollar crown. The gentle father was officially going back to sleep for the long night. The ruthless, unstoppable architect of the company was finally waking up entirely. It was time to show Victoria exactly whose floor she was bleeding on. I pushed the velvet curtain aside and stepped back into the blinding light. Be a brave lion, Daddy. I stepped back out from behind the heavy velvet curtains. The massive ballroom was completely descending into absolute, terrified chaos. Billionaires were shouting over each other in pure, unfiltered panic. I felt the heavy phantom weight of my wife's hand on my shoulder. I had spent 5 entire years running away from this exact overwhelming noise. Victoria was practically hyperventilating near the edge of the wooden stage. She grabbed Marcus by his expensive lapels, shaking him violently. I watched her completely unravel like a cheap, poorly stitched sweater. Tell them to leave right now, Marcus. Marcus violently shoved her hands off his tailored dark suit. He looked at her with a mixture of profound pity and absolute terror. I slowly walked down the center aisle, feeling every single eye shift to me. The deafening noise of the panicked crowd began to fade into white static. I looked at the massive gold company logo painted on the high ceiling. I didn't see the billions of dollars that golden crest represented. I only saw the sterile, blinding white lights of the intensive care unit. The very last day I wore a tailored suit violently rushed back to me. It is already over, Victoria. The relentless, steady beeping of the heart monitor filled the cold room. I sat by the narrow bed, holding my wife's terrifyingly frail hand. I had $40 billion sitting perfectly safe in offshore bank accounts. I owned entire hospital wings, research labs, and global pharmaceutical companies. But none of my infinite wealth could buy her a single extra breath. I felt entirely useless, completely hollowed out by the crushing, inevitable reality. The corporate titan everyone feared was reduced to a weeping, broken boy. She squeezed my fingers weakly, barely managing to turn her pale head. Do not lose your soul, Arthur. I gently kissed her knuckles, my warm tears staining her cold skin. Outside the thick glass door, my entire executive board was eagerly waiting. They were already calculating the market impact of her imminent, tragic death. The absolute disgust I felt for those vultures burned deep in my chest. I realized my massive empire had attracted the most ruthless, empty people. She coughed softly, struggling to maintain her focus on my crying face. I leaned in extremely close to hear her fading, incredibly quiet voice. Protect Lily. Hide her from the wolves. The flatline alarm pierced the air, shattering my entire universe instantly. I walked out into the harsh, brightly lit fluorescent hallway completely alone. Marcus was standing there, holding a massive stack of urgent legal documents. He offered his condolences while simultaneously asking me to sign a hostile merger. The absolute sickness of the corporate machine completely overwhelmed my grieving mind. I looked at the expensive gold pen trembling in my cold hand. I decided in that exact second to vanish completely from their greedy world. I dropped the solid gold pen onto the cold, polished linoleum floor. I am done with all of this. The sharp sound of breaking glass brought me instantly back to the present. A panicked waiter had dropped an entire tray of crystal champagne flutes. I was no longer the broken, grieving man crying in a hospital corridor. I realized my wife meant for me to protect Lily from the corporate wolves, but she never explicitly told me I couldn't hunt the wolves myself. Hiding in the shadows only let monsters like Victoria grow incredibly bold. I stepped directly in front of the elevated, brightly lit velvet stage. The cold, ruthless founder she despised was officially back from the dark grave.
Arrest him!
He is a massive fraud. Two confused hotel security guards nervously approached me from the left side. David's tactical team instantly stepped forward, blocking their path entirely. The sheer size of my security detail made the guards freeze in pure terror. Victoria's face twisted into an ugly, highly desperate mask of raw anger. She reached into her designer bag and pulled out her encrypted company tablet. She frantically tried to access the mainframe to wire the stolen money away. I watched her pathetic, scrambling fingers fail the biometric security check repeatedly. She was locked out of the entire company server, completely blind and helpless. Why is my access completely denied? I calmly walked up the short flight of velvet stairs to the wooden stage. My cheap, scuffed shoes made absolutely no sound on the thick red carpet. Victoria backed away from me, her expensive diamond necklace shaking violently. Marcus remained completely frozen, not daring to breathe or make a single sound. The entire room of 300 executives fell dead silent once again. They were watching a lowly data analyst take control of the entire stage. I picked up the silver microphone Victoria had dropped on the wooden floor. The cold metal felt incredibly familiar, like an old, highly dangerous weapon. Your access is denied by the founder. Victoria let out a sharp, incredulous laugh that sounded completely unhinged. She pointed a physically shaking finger at my faded, poorly tailored gray suit. Her massive ego completely refused to accept the terrifying reality standing before her. I looked directly into her frantic, wildly darting, heavily mascaraed dark eyes. I felt a profound sense of closure locking heavily and permanently into place. The weak ghost I had carefully constructed for 5 years was finally burning away. I turned to David, who was standing completely still at the stage base. It was finally time to show the entire world the absolute, undeniable truth. You are just a pathetic little clerk. I nodded once at David, giving him the ultimate, highly secretive, silent command. He reached into his dark coat and pressed a single button on his remote. The massive digital projector behind the stage instantly flared to brilliant white life. The 50-foot screen displayed the company's ultimate charter and master cap table. At the very top, the name of the absolute majority shareholder glowed in bright red. My full legal name, Arthur Sterling, was displayed massively for everyone to see. The collective gasp from 300 people actually sucked the oxygen out. Victoria slowly turned around to look at the massive, glowing projector screen. Meet Arthur Sterling, your majority owner. Victoria stared at the massive 50-foot screen in absolute horror. Bright red letters of my true name reflected in her wide eyes. I felt a massive surge of vindication wash over my entire chest. The vicious monster who tortured my innocent employees was finally trapped entirely. She slowly turned her head back to look at my calm face. All the expensive makeup in the world could not hide her pure terror. Her entire false reality was rapidly collapsing in real time. This is a forged document. It has to be. I stepped forward, closing the physical distance between us completely. My cheap gray suit suddenly felt like impenetrable, heavy titanium armor. I remembered the exact day I hired her 5 long years ago. She had lied to my face then, just like she lied today. David calmly handed me the thick red folder containing her financial death warrant. I dropped it heavily onto the wooden podium directly in front of her. Read your offshore bank statements, Victoria. 5 years ago, Victoria sat across from my massive mahogany founder's desk. I was exhausted, grieving deeply, and desperately looking for an interim CEO. She placed her hand over her heart and swore to protect my employees. I was far too blind with sorrow to see the venomous snake. The painful memory of her fake, highly sympathetic smile made me violently sick. I had handed my wife's beautiful legacy to a ruthless, greedy thief. I will guard your legacy, Arthur. The violent truth of her massive theft was now exposed for everyone. Victoria's perfectly manicured hands shook violently over the open red folder. Detailed financial documents showed exactly how she stole $60 million. I felt completely disgusted that I had let this happen for so long. Marcus stepped out from the paralyzed crowd of incredibly wealthy executives. He looked at the undeniable proof and physically recoiled in pure disgust. The illusion of her flawless corporate leadership was completely dead forever. You stole from the employee pension fund? The entire crowd of 300 elites turned violently against her. Angry whispers rapidly escalated into loud, vicious shouts of absolute outrage. I watched the heavy crown of stolen power completely fall from her head. This was exactly the ruthless public execution she had planned for me tonight. The utter poetry of her total destruction felt incredibly, deeply satisfying. Victoria frantically looked around for a single friendly face in the massive crowd. She was completely surrounded by the very angry wolves she used to lead. I can explain the missing money. Outside, the wailing sound of heavy police sirens violently pierced the rainstorm. 6 bright blue and red cruisers aggressively blocked the Grand Hotel driveway entirely. I had authorized David to call the federal authorities an hour ago. I wanted her to leave this glamorous building in cold steel handcuffs. The terrifying flashing lights painted the wet pavement in sharp, violent colors. The arrogant valet ran away from the heavily armed tactical police officers. Secure the entire perimeter right now! The loud police sirens echoed clearly through the massive, thick ballroom walls. Victoria heard the terrifying noise and completely lost her arrogant mind. She dropped the heavy silver microphone and bolted toward the velvet side exit. I didn't even flinch or move a single muscle to stop her escape. My late wife always said extremely guilty people will eventually run themselves down. David's massive security contractors casually stepped into her desperate, highly frantic path. She crashed violently into a solid wall of pure muscle and dark suits. You are not going anywhere, Victoria. 2 large federal agents pushed through the massive oak ballroom doors. They marched straight down the center aisle, their gold badges flashing brightly. I stepped down from the wooden stage, my absolute authority completely restored. Victoria fell to her shaking knees right in the middle of the red carpet. The untouchable, highly arrogant queen of the boardroom was reduced to a weeping mess. She looked up at me with thick, black mascara running heavily down her face. I felt absolutely no pity for the woman who tried to crush my soul. Arthur, please do not do this. I looked down at the exact spot where she had thrown the copper cent. I bent down and picked up the dirty, heavily scratched piece of useless metal. The cold copper felt incredibly heavy with 5 years of silent, burning rage. I thought about Lily, crying softly because of this horrible woman's pure evil. I flicked the tiny coin gently directly at her expensive, shiny designer shoes. It landed with a tiny, completely pathetic click against the polished marble floor. Take the cent and run, Victoria. The federal agents aggressively pulled her up by her expensive red silk sleeves. The cold, heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly around her thin, trembling wrists. They marched her forcefully out of the ballroom and into the massive, crowded lobby. I followed closely behind, needing to ensure the absolute finality of her ruin. Hundreds of wealthy hotel guests stopped and stared at her highly humiliating public downfall. I felt a massive, incredibly heavy weight finally lift off my tired, aching shoulders. The weak ghost of the data analyst was permanently dead and buried tonight. You have the right to remain silent. I watched the heavy police cruiser doors slam shut aggressively. Victoria pressed her tear-stained face against the cold, reinforced glass. The flashing red lights finally washed away 5 years of darkness. I felt a profound, absolute peace settling deep inside my chest. Arthur! I pushed open the heavy velvet curtains of the dim room. Lily was sitting quietly on the soft carpet with her bear. I was utterly terrified she would see me as a ruthless monster. She dropped the bear and ran completely across the wide space. Lily, you came back. I caught her instantly, burying my face in her soft hair. The fierce corporate titan vanished, leaving only a grateful father behind. She pulled back and looked directly into my tired, wet eyes. I saw absolute pride shining clearly in her small, innocent face. It is all over now. The bright morning sun poured violently through the massive glass windows. I stood perfectly straight in front of the expensive crystal mirror. I slowly tied a flawless silk knot in my dark tie. The cheap gray suits were burning in an incinerator right now. Time to go to work. The heavy mahogany doors swung open with a loud, commanding thud. 12 terrified board members instantly shot up from their expensive chairs. I walked slowly down the long, polished, highly expensive wooden table. I completely remembered the pure disgust they showed me yesterday. Good morning, Mr. Sterling. I sat down heavily in the massive leather chair at the head. I placed Victoria's exact red financial folder directly in the center. The absolute silence in the room was incredibly heavy and suffocating. I looked at each terrified, greedy face with pure, unfiltered authority. We are changing every single rule. The cold marble steps felt incredibly solid under my expensive shoes. Reporters flashed hundreds of bright cameras directly at the heavy metal doors. Victoria shuffled out slowly, wearing a bright orange prison jumpsuit. Seeing her completely stripped of her stolen power felt remarkably right. Any words for the founder? Victoria completely ignored the screaming reporters and looked directly at me. Her arrogant, heavily painted eyes were now completely hollow and dark. I didn't offer her a single ounce of highly unearned sympathy. I turned my back completely, erasing her entirely from my universe. Enjoy the cage, Victoria. The gentle wind rustled through the massive, ancient weeping willow tree. I knelt down carefully on the soft, perfectly trimmed green grass. I placed a bouquet of fresh white lilies on the cold marble. The heavy guilt of running away was completely gone from my soul. I kept the wolves away. Lily laughed loudly, swinging extremely high into the bright blue sky. I stood by the metal pole, watching her without any fear. We didn't have to hide in the tiny, cramped apartment anymore. I realized true power isn't about hiding. It's about protecting the innocent. Look at me go, Daddy! I caught her gently as she jumped safely into my waiting arms. The absolute darkest chapter of our lives was officially closed forever. Sometimes you have to let the monster out to slay the dragons. But you also need a beautiful reason to put the monster away. Drop a like if this one hit different. Have you ever been in a room where someone looked through you instead of at you? Tell me about it below. Leave your story in the comments. I read every single one. And I'll see you in the next one.